So I guess my answer to the question is it a water issue? Is of course, because that's what my group does. And we work on helping our clients, whether they're municipalities, governments, whether they're oil sands producers or mining companies, to deal with their water issues. And it's a very multidisciplinary approach that we try to take because, as you, I think, are all aware, water issues are exceedingly complex. I'm going to speak about mining for my examples, partly because it's what I personally know best, but also because it's incredibly important to the Canadian economy, and there are huge technological challenges. And the Ring of Fire is an example of an area where the development has huge impacts and huge complexities around water, and so an area that we have a great deal of interest in and have worked in before. But when you think about resource industries, I think the first thing is that they're in the business of mining. They're in the business of oil production. They're not in the business of water. And so most of the people here today are somehow in the business of water. And so we're now going and talking with them about how water is impacting them. And historically, I would say mining companies would treat water as a raw material and a critical raw material for their production, and an environmental interface on the back end. But we're seeing a huge transition, and you talked about the fact that it's going to #1 in the risks, economic risks in the world, and I would say that mining companies are now recognizing increasingly that water is becoming one of their #1 risks. And there's been a really huge change, and if you just count the change by the number of conferences on water and mining that are out there right now. Every other week there's another conference, another seminar on water and mining. It's really gone to very, very high priority. And why is that? Well, as I said, they're in the business of mining, and they want to get the material out of the ground as efficiently as possible. They need water as a raw material. And so if there's a risk to the water supply, or difficulty in getting the water that they need, that's a risk to production. And so we have companies in Chile who are literally pumping water from the ocean 3,000 meters to elevation to the mines to do the flotation circuits because of the amount of water that they need at huge cost. We have mining companies in less dry areas, but that are still having to work with stakeholders to balance the agricultural needs with what the mine wants to do. The mine wants to come and use a massive amount of water. The aquifers maybe have been historically drawn down, and there's a huge competition for resources, and this is a big issue in South Africa, trying to balance economic development versus agricultural needs or community needs. So huge and community engagement that's required to secure water rights. On the back end of the plant, if you have problems with managing your water or keeping your water clean for discharge, you can be shut down at huge, again, economic impact to the company. So Barrick, large Canadian gold company, is currently in shutdown in their Pascua-Lama project in Chile due to water management issues. And not only are they in shutdown, which is costing them millions of dollars every month, but they've also been assessed huge fines. And that's a water management issue that they're dealing with. And then corporate social responsibility. Mining companies are increasingly trying to engage with their stakeholders, their local communities, the indigenous peoples, and also their shareholders are holding them accountable. The Global Reporting Initiative looks at how well companies are doing in managing environmental and sustainability issues. And it's not just because the shareholders are good-hearted and want to only make green investments, is because they recognize that these risks, if water is not being well managed and other environmental issues are not being well managed, it can shut down the project at great risk to the investment. So it's an investment risk. And regulation is increasing as well. And so we see this huge increase in the number of species that are being regulated and tightening of the regulations. And that's driving a lot of technology adoption by mining companies as they try to deal with these issues. So two more specific examples. One is Anglo American, one of the largest mining companies in the world, huge presence in South Africa. And they have reported that 83% of their operations will be in water-stressed regions by the year 2025. So water supply is a huge issue for them. And they're taking a very broad view of how to look at these issues and manage those risks. And it's interesting that they do talk about water as risk. They don't talk about it as an environmental issue. They talk about it now as a business risk because that's what they measure. So it's been a really interesting transition. So they've tried to put some numbers around the risk. So they say that $4 billion in capital is at risk because of water issues. They see huge increases in costs, 500% increase in the contracted water costs in their operations in Chile. And in South Africa, they're seeing a 19% inflation rate in water for their mines in South Africa. So this is very much top of mind. And they have been I think one of the first companies, but many other companies are doing this, where they've actually elevated water to such a huge issue that they are appointing very senior people to be the water champion. Many companies are now appointing vice presidents of water to try and address these issues. And they're investing in a lot of technologies and trying to look at ways to reduce the amount of water that they're using in their operations. Another example a little bit closer to home is Teck in the Elk Valley in British Columbia. The 100 years of coal mining has resulted in building up of selenium levels in the Elk Valley. And the BC government has increased regulation and has set very aggressive targets for what selenium management. And Teck has responded. I'm sure some of you are working in Teck-funded research projects in this very complex area. They are currently, they're commissioning their first plant on a $600 million capital program over 5 years to build a series of water treatment plants and water management systems up the Elk Valley. And they estimate that it will cost them $40 million a year to operate that water treatment program. So this is a huge impact and a really important environmental impact to try and deal with this. And there's a really interesting discussion happening back to the water energy nexus of what is the appropriate level to manage the environmental impact of selenium, because it costs money, but it also takes energy to do these sorts of treatments. And so how do you manage the overall complexity of that? Where is the trade-off? Where's the ultimate benefit and the right targets? So there's a lot of really interesting research in this area happening around the country. The water has become such a big issue for mining that the International Council of Mining and Metals published their water stewardship framework in 2014. So this is very topical, very much front of mind. And they are now advocating a catchment-based approach to water management so that the mining companies need to look beyond their mining properties and into the entire catchment from an impact point of view, but also from a security of water point of view, looking at how are they managing with stakeholders. And they're advocating a very holistic approach. And this is one of the things that I'm trying to do at Hatch, is to bring in all these various disciplines that we have around the company to help our clients to work their way through these increasingly complex issues. But mining companies aren't set up to address water as a complex issue for the most part. They're trying to figure out how to do it. And I think this is where technology and knowledge, the kind of things that you're working on, can come in. And interesting that it becomes a corporate governance issue. It's how are they measuring performance? How are they reporting performance? How are they making decisions? And so in the corporations, one of the ways that they're trying to get at that governance is people are incentivized throughout the corporation to make decisions. And if we can find better ways of assessing the impact on water and then incentivizing and looking at trade-offs to reduce the amount of water, to minimize the amount of risk, we may make some very different process decisions upstream or mining decisions upstream that will actually save the overall water and energy. But that's going to take some really complex models, some monitoring technology, the sorts of things that you're working on to make more informed decisions throughout the whole corporation. So anyhow, I think it's a really fascinating area. It's an area that is really expanding and growing, and it is a truly multidisciplinary area. And it's been really interesting to see how the multidisciplinary approaches to water are happening in the university. That it's no longer, when I went through engineering, the civils worried about water and everybody else worried about everything else. And now you see water programs coming in, chemical engineering, biochemical engineering, and of course biology and the environmental sciences coming in as well. And I'm sure there's water programs associated in other engineering and science departments. So it's really, truly becoming a multidisciplinary approach, and I'm sure the Canadian Water Network is a huge part of that.
There. Thank you. Very interesting. When Desikan talked about the World Economic Forum moving water up to the #1 risk, and I was the first chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council, and the issue sprung immediately into preeminence. It'd be lovely to say this was because I was the first chair and we said such enlightened and startling things that everybody immediately recognized the wisdom of what we were saying. What in fact happened is that the big credit houses, the big companies that give debt, the financial houses that give debt, started to include water availability, sufficient water of the right quality, as part of their debt assessment criteria. And suddenly this moved way up from the chief water engineer, if the company even had one, to the corporate social responsibility issue, or to the issue which was nice to know but not necessary to know. Suddenly this moved way, way up into the corner office. Our debt is going to cost more because we don't have an assured supply of water, or because we're not taking care of our water risks. So you find your allies in interesting places, and the principal ally was another group that didn't care about water, which was the great big financial houses. They were not there to, with the avowed purpose of promoting better water management in the world. They were there to make money. And they said, we're not going to make as much money if there's water risks that aren't covered. So you find your allies in interesting places, and remember to lift up the rock that they might be hiding under. So, okay, Bob, I said I'd come back to you and say, where do you look for success? Where do you see the factors that do now or will ultimately lead to getting out of what you described, which is pretty doleful?
Well, I wasn't being doleful. I mean, I think there's a lot of positive things happening. I think some of the things that Emily was talking about, particularly around and Desikan too, is the greater appreciation for the regional impact. So if you look, for example, at, to take a Canadian example, at the McKinsey study that Tom Berger carried out 40 years ago, that was a major breakthrough for a couple of reasons. One, because it looked at the whole valley as a whole, and looked at it as a catchment area, and looked at it not only as a physical catchment area, but also because he insisted on taking the commission to the people and engaging communities and letting communities talk about what they thought of the development. And I think that has been transformative in the country's experience. I think moving to greater self-government in the Northwest Territories, in the creation of Nunavut as a separate territory, greater self-governing powers for Yukon, and the whole land use process that's underway in those territories is way ahead of where we've been, as has the James Bay process in Quebec. So there's lots of positives. Where we continue to face a challenge is in the northern parts of the provinces that have had historic treaties that have kept people in a sandbox that doesn't work anymore. The Indian Act sandbox doesn't work, and the treaty sandbox, as it has been interpreted by the governments, doesn't work. So you need to broaden the scope, and one of the issues that we're negotiating and sometimes debating in the Ring of Fire is to say, if we just take one small mining project and study that. The problem is it doesn't deal with what are going to be the broader impacts of mining development over the next 25 years on the Albany, the Attawapiskat rivers and the entire river system, and what will the impacts be on any number of communities that are part of that system. And the companies that look at this with horror and say, oh my God, we're going to be tied up for the next N years in studies and we're never going to get anywhere. And the First Nations are very anxious to say, well, we can't be the first, we can't allow something to happen without having much better knowledge of what the impacts are going to be, in particular as it relates to water. The water issue in the Ring of Fire is huge because the Ring of Fire gives it a dry sound. The whole area is a bog. It's a swamp. It's muskeg. It's all floating on water and ice for all the time. So if you fly over it, you just see river after stream after lake after river after stream after lake, and you realize that this is a water system. So how do you deal with that? And how do you say, okay, now we're going to move an open pit mine into the middle of this water system? Well, that's what it is. That's the proposal. That's the Cliffs. That was the Cliffs proposal. Size of 2 football fields. You know, you say there's enormous, huge open pit structure we're going to create. We're then going to build roads or a railway. We don't know. You know, people are still debating about what that's going to. So to say, have you really thought this through? Like, do you really understand what the implications of this are and what it could do if there's a breakdown? What the impact will be on water and everything else. So, I think, again, without flogging this horse too much, it's really a governance issue. How do you want to treat this? But it's a governance issue in the sense of saying we do need to find some answers and solutions. What I found very encouraging about Desikan's presentation was, India and Pakistan were able to find a solution. Well, with great respect to our own country, if India and Pakistan can find a solution on a water project, we ought to be able to find one in Northern Ontario, right? We ought to be able to find a solution. It shouldn't be beyond our imagination to say what it is. But what I think has changed in people's awareness and consciousness is not that people are simply opposing development. It's that people are looking for sustainability and understanding better what companies are prepared to do for sustainability. The recent approval in Nunavut, for example, of the major mining project just north of Frobisher Bay, north of Iqaluit, is an example where there was a panel that involved the government of the territory. It was run by the government of the territory. It involved the local communities. They eventually came up with a panel report with respect to the assessment, and it is going forward. It's complex, it's big. Some people still object to the development. Similarly, the same case in many of the developments in Labrador, which are large and intrusive and complex, but are nevertheless, in many cases, going forward. What's different about the way they're going forward is that the benefits are flowing more clearly to the communities, so they will be in a position to deal with some of the impacts more effectively than before, and they're able to have a say in, well, how is this going to work, and how can we maintain the necessary protections for people?
Wow, yeah.
And that is starting to change. And again, I suspect that this is equally true in South Africa. It's equally true in many countries that have gone through this whole period of time. I mean, we're really coming out of a time when engineering was the answer. We have a technical answer to this problem. And I think more and more people are understanding that engineering innovation is great, but
it's a starting place.
Let's understand what the impacts are on people.
Yeah.
And let's understand what the long-term impacts are in the environment. And sometimes projects won't go ahead for that reason. Sometimes they will go ahead. But I think we're reaching a better place now than we were in 30 or 40 years ago.
Thank you. Desikan, the India-Pakistan example is quite fascinating. When Bob said, why can't we do that? How much public consultation was there with the people that live in that area of either India or Pakistan?
Extensive.
Really?
Absolutely extensive, yeah.
You astonished me. I'm delighted.
But there was a peculiarity around it, that the territory for the local people is neither India nor Pakistan. It is in fact Khalistan.
Yes.
So in a strange kind of way, it made the discussion much more equal. That you actually had a third party, which were the people who actually lived there, who both considered the two other parties to actually be invaders on their territory. So it's not a dynamic that you're going to find in many places.
Yes.
You're going to have to be much more ingenious about that.
Well, if life were simple, it wouldn't be so interesting, yes.
But can I pull out a related issue?
Yes.
Related to actually something Bob spoke about in his initial presentation. Around the folk in the world that are going to be helping other folk in the world to reach targets and what that could mean. We're on the brink of declaring the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. It appears that there will be a much more substantive water goal now compared to the MDGs. It also appears that there's going to be a sanitation goal. In fact, a couple of goals related to both of them. Now, clearly there's an opportunity to have the right kind of global alliances to make sure that the servicing works. But it can also happen in a way that takes us many steps back. So if, for example, people carried forward the gold standard of safe sanitation as being sewage, or waterborne sewage, we're once again going to see all of these white elephants of new sewage infrastructure sitting in some very dry parts of the world that will work for the first 2 or 3 inspection reports, and then after that will take people not back to the place where they currently are, but even further back than that. So there's a different way in which we need to have this conversation going forward. And there are a sufficient number of indicators that are telling us that we're all in a different conversation. I mean, whatever drove the corporates, and you're quite right about the debt capital, whatever drove the corporates to this recognition of the value of water is a good place for it to be, because now we can have a different conversation about that. We need to go to the next step, though, to start talking to the same mining houses about their historical ecological debts. For example, acid mine water, which we sit with all over the world. Canada and South Africa are 2 prime examples, but no longer restricted to us. So I think there's an opportunity space there, Margaret. We just have to use it smartly, and we have to use it quickly, because the announcement of the new AIDS programs will happen in September already, and they could very well go the wrong way.
Yes, and it's really all in the cities, because it's really it's almost a condition of being a city dweller that you have waterborne sewage. I mean, you can come up with, so far, I mean, you can come up with really good new technology, and bless Gates Foundation for having had the courage to offer a huge reward for the best new toilet. And everybody laughed and said, you know, come on, best new toilet. But I mean, there's absolute wisdom in this, because you're quite right. If we really put a push on global sanitation and it all ends up being waterborne sanitation, we've increased the environmental problem, we've increased the water shortage problem. And there are new prototypes coming up, and the problem that we hit is one of the things I was talking about, is people don't want a non-waterborne toilet, because the status of having arrived has a toilet. Not only that, it has to be an indoor toilet, and not only that, you know, it has to be associated with water.
One of the things, just on this point about drinking water, is one of the problems, I think, and I'm not, and I'm sure there are many people out here who've got far more knowledge than I do, but I think one of the problems we have is that the standards that have been created at the national level, and even at the provincial level, drive solutions that are large and complex, and that get to a level that they say, well, that's the level, you know, you need that. You need a Cadillac. And you sort of say, I don't think we need a Cadillac for 500 people. You know, we need a system that we can actually maintain that's going to produce water that's drinkable and that's serviceable and that works. But it might not be the solution that would work for Guelph or, you know, for somewhere else. It's going to be different. And our systems don't allow for that. And this is why I call it's in essentially colonial structures. They say, no, everybody has to have this. You know, everybody is going to have the same technology. And you have to ask yourself the question, is this really the way to go? Or You know, and then you get the other debate. People say, well, I mean, so you're saying we're worth less than somebody else. You say, no, it's not about being worth less. It's about designing the systems so that they're actually appropriate for the problems they're intended to solve. Yeah. And I think we're not there yet, and that's a real problem.
The big C gets in there too, the corruption problem. The corruption of a bigger system has more rent. If it's a rent-seeking society, and so therefore the great big billion-dollar system, certainly it pays a lot more in under-the-table payments if it's that kind of society than a very small one does. So you've got the corruption on the part of the would-be installer and the receiver, the decision maker. So that's why corruption ends up being such a bad factor in terms of technology choice, because you're right, it's the standards. But then they're corrupted by the fact that, as you say, people want a Cadillac. And then there may be some pretty perverse things going on in terms of the payments for the Cadillac, and that's all over the world. So, yes, Desikan is smiling unhappily, if you can smile unhappily. Desikan, Emily talked about some pretty powerful leverages to promote change in corporations. Cost, fear, risk, derision, and regulation. So, those will get to just about any boardroom, and certainly will get to the corner office. How did you get to the change you're talking about in South Africa with Work for Water? None of these points of leverage is particularly appropriate. How did you get there? Because that wasn't where you started after the original laws went through about water for all.
The major driver in the government decision wasn't about the water. What it was about a model for economic development in a time in South Africa that desperately needed to bring many more people into the economy that were previously excluded. It's very similar to the ethanol sugarcane discussion in Brazil. Eventually, it was an energy project, but initially it was a poverty alleviation project. And that's the tide that was rowed upon. It also had incredibly good political leadership. This program was led by Professor Kader Asmal, who you know quite well.
Yes.
Who, with a combination of his ability to tie different things together and just incredible charisma, managed to get very large-scale investment into this. And in this case, while the science led initially, the science then followed. Because science has always got to be there. So the continuous scientific evaluation of impact and feeding that back into the system is what maintained the momentum from 1995 to now.
And it worked.
And it worked.
Yeah. No, I mean, Emily gave part of the key when she said mining companies were saying that water is not our business. And Bob Ray is saying, that the levels of government were saying, well, no, water's not our business. And, our business is housing up in the north, or our business is any of these things. Water is not our business. And trying to get across that chasm, that Antarctic-sized chasm is extraordinarily difficult because we do our budgeting so differently. I mean, I was a federal civil servant for many years, and it was hellishly difficult to get even the time frames for spending in a project, let alone adjusting part of that project so that it was doing something that looked like a different kind of activity than the primary activity. Was extraordinarily difficult. Governments don't necessarily have that kind of flexibility. I mean, are you moving towards more flexibility or less flexibility in South Africa?
That would be telling. But I think that what we're finding very rapidly is that the fluidity and the appetite for adventure that we had in the first two periods first two terms of democracy are not really there anymore. We're becoming much more traditional, and we're becoming much like the rest of the world, where the inflexibility is coming in, much more need for the regulatory tool, much less appetite for newer, more novel experiments, and it's worrying. It certainly is worrying. But at the same time, you see that the drivers are driving some of the other players towards greater adventure. I mean, one of the issues that we see in the South African environment with corporate is that because many of them play in a global market now, the global customer base becomes a very influential factor. So people want to see what the sustainability parameters are and whether or not that's the right choice to make. And then it goes all the way back.
It's an interesting link to technology, because the corporation needs to be able to roll up reporting from their operations all around the world. And of course, they're different all around the world. And so there's a lot of interesting technology right now in how do you make that easier? How do you make that more transparent? Which, again, increases the ability to have good open communications with communities and stakeholders and shareholders. So things like the Global Reporting Initiative is actually driving a lot of technology and really interesting things happening all the way down to the operating site and then rolling back up to the corporate offices. So it's a fascinating time to be involved in this industry. And of course, social media. I mean, you just think about if you make a mistake, the impact is huge in terms of your reputation. And we see this now with the development of the oil sands. I mean, the information, the need for transparency is absolutely massive. And so being able to get good, reliable information is critically important.
And one other point is that although as Canadians we like to think of ourselves as being way ahead of everybody else, the reality is that we're not. And
sure.
That in my conversations with many companies or with consultants who are advising companies, they will frequently say, we're expected to do far more in a whole lot of countries than we're actually expected to do in Canada. That corporate social responsibility is not, and they're not complaining. I mean, they're not going to go to the government of Canada and say, please get us to do more because we have to do more. When we do a mine in Ghana, we have to do all this other stuff, and when we do a mine in northern Canada, we don't have to do it. So they're not complaining about it, but that is actually a problem for us, is to become more aware of what the standards are and how increasingly global they are becoming, and how that relates to how we situate ourselves, which is why I always now try to ask Canadians to situate where we are in the context of where the world is, because what's going on here is very much part of what's going on in every other part of the globe. And we have to think more and more that way, rather than simply to look at it from the point of view of how we've always done things in this country. The comparison is no longer with, well, what did we do 10 years ago? The comparison is, how are we doing compared to others? And that's just the way in which we have to respond as companies and as governments and as individuals in looking at this whole area of change. We can no longer, the comparator is no longer, well, we're better than we used to be. Well, if you're a company and you say we're better than we used to be, you could be Kodak. Yeah, you're better than you used to be, but look at the world around you.
You ain't there anymore.
You're not there anymore because the world around you has changed so completely.
Yeah. You're leading nicely into one of the things I wanted to ask you, because Emily set out a very powerful series of motivators for companies, and then she added the fact that there was internal and company, corporate-wide, sector-wide monitoring of these issues. Are these, I'm not sure what word I want to use, the Canadian, I'll leave that beginning of the question up in the air, but the Canadian view on these things is we obviously need more government regulation, or governments need to step in, governments need to ensure, governments need to take a harder and faster and more regulated position in these areas. Are the things that Emily's talking about sufficiently powerful that they may be a better way of going at moving towards compliance? I know it's not either or, but you must have reflected on this, particularly with the work that you've been doing on the Ring of Fire. And you come from the proud government tradition of saying, this is a job for the government to...
Yeah, I mean, I think having been involved as a first minister, I think after 5 years of being a first minister, you're a little less enamored of what actually government can do.
Yes.
In every circumstance. Certainly become aware of some of the challenges internal to government itself. But the other reality is that it's not, when you look at mining, for example, how does mining work? Well, mining works with geologists and prospectors going out and saying, here, wow, look at this possibility. You then have a junior mining company that says, okay, we'll take it to the next phase, and then you have Big Mama, Big Papa comes in and says, okay, now we'll do the work. And the reality is that the smaller companies do not have the capacity to do a lot of the things that governments are now saying you've got to do. You've got to consult, you've got to accommodate, you've got to do this, you've got to be prepared on the environmental stuff, you've got to have, and they don't have the capital to do this. And it's a simple reality that they're not big enough to do it. So then you get into a problem, well then who is going to do this and how is it going to get done? And that I think is a practical problem that we face when we look at something like mining and resource development. Who's actually expected to be corporately responsible, meaning spend a lot of money? I mean, if you're a Rio Tinto or a large mining company, you can spend it. I'm doing some work in Western Canada and British Columbia with a couple of large companies that are involved in a pipeline, natural gas pipeline proposal with First Nations, and I'm working on behalf of the First Nations. And you're dealing with Chevron. It's like dealing with a large government. I mean, with all that entails. Yes, they have a lot of resources. They also have huge amount of process, very complicated to get things moving and going forward, but that's what you have behind them. They're able to engage in a level of community engagement and other things that a smaller company simply wouldn't be able to do. And I think one of the frustrations that's happening in Western Canada is the smaller companies are having a very hard time meeting the new standards and doing what's required, and then pulling off fully the community engagement process.
Whether these standards are set by
whatever they
corporate,
doesn't matter.
That's right, or by government.
Yeah, I mean, you'll often have a junior mining company. Well, how many junior mining companies have signed, the global initiative that's been signed by the mining companies to say, here's all the things we're going to do, here's the relationships we're going to have with Indigenous people around the world. And frequently I'll have a conversation with a junior mining company to say, well, here's your standard. I didn't invent it. It's the industry standard. And they said, well, we can't afford to do that.
Yeah. I think governments have to be involved in getting into this regional conversation, because even the large mining houses, I mean, Anglo American as an example, in South Africa, they're practically, they're big enough in South Africa that they can sort of collaborate with other mining houses and maybe come up to a regional solution. And I know there's discussions on that on acid mine drainage. But Anglo American in Canada is a couple of mines, one in BC, and I can't remember where the other one is right now. They're just properties. And so to actually be able to drive regional engagement becomes a big cost for those properties. So I think you have to see that cooperation, whether it's federal government, whether it's provincial government, whether it's a consortium of First Nations who are driving that conversation and setting that negotiation. It has to be there. And one of the biggest risks that we're seeing in developing around the world is where there is not stability in the expectations. And so there's negotiation in the courts, which is, in Chile right now, is really stopping a lot of development. It has economic impacts. And it's very much driven by changes in governance that are happening. It's a very fluid situation, but right now it's stalling a lot of development. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but it's very difficult for mining companies to sort of work out which way is up. And I think it's true of other resource. So government has a huge role, absolutely, because it's an economic development question.
We're going to have time for a couple of questions from the audience, just to make sure that we're talking about the things that are top of your mind. So, as I say, be thinking of what you would really like to ask. But I want to ask one more question that underlies a number of the things that we've been talking about as a panel, and that is my abyss at the beginning, the crevasse of how incredibly difficult interdisciplinarity is. I mean, you fund everything about water out of one pot. Does this make things more interdisciplinary in terms of what the result is or the way that that folk behave afterward? When I talk to scholars about this, they say, Maggie, everything pushes you to be more unisectoral, because you're a way of getting advancement, your publications, your career record. If you start branching out, you may do something socially worthwhile, but it's very much at the cost of your own career, therefore the family revenues, all of the rest of it. I mean, how can we address this? How can we start? Because when you talk to our young scholars and our young professionals, they are vitally aware of the fact that the solutions, you know, the question, is it really a water issue? They're very well aware that the answer is yes and no. But how do we create a society which is much more porous in terms of really allowing and expecting and demanding this kind of cross-sectoral interdisciplinarity to be brought to bear, so that we don't discover these things by flying over the north and finding all sorts of white elephants, and ditto for development assistance projects. Not that experts would necessarily have avoided these, but we know that we have to look at these from the standpoint of more than one discipline. But how do we make this happen? You want to start?
I'll have a go. Many of the issues you raised are the absolute barriers. Key to it is what the research institutions define as the performance indicators. And the bigger culprits in this domain are actually universities. Mm-hmm. Because it's not just about the interdisciplinary work, but it also extends moving out of the laboratory into actually demonstrating that a product works. Is hugely disencouraged by academic institutions.
That's terrifying.
And there doesn't seem to be too much that is going to change it. I mean, I used to work at a university for a while, and I was accused of destroying the academic tradition.
And you wanted useful stuff.
It was a terrible thing.
Oh dear.
The way funding institutions can deal with this, and the experiments that we do at the Water Research Commission, is that you put the challenge out to people. You can keep your traditions, or you can follow the money. And sometimes following the money actually works. So we create multidisciplinary platforms in things that we call lighthouses. And we're starting to knock on the right doors. So there is some movement. There are some very enthusiastic players, but they're very small in number. Interestingly, there seems to be a trend with different disciplines. Although I least expected it, social scientists were most adverse to working interdisciplinary.
Well, they don't speak the same language.
Indeed, this is some of what they put up. And those isolated folk, like the physicists, are quite happy to deal with everybody. Maybe because we have too few friends, and we need more friends. but it's counterintuitive, and where it catches on, it tends to work well, but there isn't a wildfire around
it. The Canadian Water Network, after 14 years of existence, is really putting its whole future, the future emanation of what we want to do, into exactly this kind of interdisciplinarity, of creating consortiums of demand, i.e. municipal utility managers, and then putting these together with researchers that are willing to actually look at the problem as it exists, and not necessarily what I would like to study about that problem and publish about it. It'd be great if they can publish it, but we're really taking the risk of our entire future life by saying, can we say to mining and companies that have big watershed interests, we can put you together on a continuing basis with a number of researchers who also care about the outcome and are willing to adjust, inshallah, their research schedule and their research lives to actually address and answer some of the issues. So this is, anything but, for somebody associated with CWN, this is anything but a hypothetical issue. Can we really move this interdisciplinarity issue into reality? Because we can't just give them water solutions. It's got to be water plus plus. Bob, wisdom, please.
Two adages of mine. First one is the biggest problem in government today is silos. It's the big problem. I used to face it every day as a first minister, constantly confronting the problem that different ministries had different agendas that had nothing to do with solving a problem. And we really have to work at that and become very unpopular internally for cracking heads. And the second one is that the definition of good public policy is what we do after we've exhausted all the alternatives. And I think that's actually true. And I think in many cases we're coming pretty close to that. So I think, you know, the way you respond to the status quo is by saying, is this actually working? You know, tell me how it's working. And if the answer is no, it's not really working, well, then you have to be more creative. And I think the CWN is a very good example of how you actually break down a lot of this thing. Don't wait for government or a mining company or somebody else to solve, or a university, God forbid, to solve the problem. It's got to come from other more creative new institutions that are going to break down the older institutions. And that is what is required. I can tell you, I found as again, in government, that there was hardly any social scientist out there who was doing anything that was of remote, real connection to what governments were actually interested in. And it was kind of shocking when you think about the, you know, the role that, you know, ideas are supposed to play in the formation of public policy. You say, well, where are these great ideas coming from? And much of what the academics were talking about was absolutely incomprehensible to anybody else. And so you say, well, you know, what use is this to what we're trying to solve here? And then they say, well, we're not going to have the government tell us what to do. You say, well, no, but it'd be nice if you could tell us what to do in a way that we could understand it and use it. And I think that's the gap that you have to keep on trying to bridge. And that's why, and I'm not here just praising the organization that has asked me to be a speaker, but
We like that.
I'm sure you like it anyway, but it seems to me that's why you need other places that are going to be far more creative in bringing people together. That's what Mars was intended to do in Toronto. And one of the, you know, well, you hope that that's one of the things that will continue to happen, is that people will be brought together so they can actually find solutions to things.
Well, it's an area where companies really have an advantage, because they can simply say, we've got to solve this problem, and so therefore they can go looking for this. Whereas, again, I get back to treasury strictures and project formation strictures and all of the strictures that you talked about. They're very difficult to get around. You know, companies have a little more freedom in this area.
They do, but I would say if you were to ask our CEO what is our biggest challenge as an engineering company, it's silos. We're full of engineers. Engineers tend to want to go deep in their specialty area, so you have a lot of specialists. But what I have found personally, when I was first asked to come into the water business at Hatch, I was asked to sort of say, what should we be doing? You know, we had little pockets of different specialty skills all over, but what's the target? And I chose mining because of our history. But when you start to choose an area to go after, everything starts to kind of fill in behind it, and people start to work together. You start to assemble teams, and new things happen. And so I think that idea of picking the lighthouse or picking the, you know, what does the Canadian Water Network want to solve is much more powerful. I've seen a lot of universities that I've visited, and water's the hot topic. Everybody's trying to start a center for water, and it's a collection of 5 different researchers who are all doing something in water, but they're completely disparate, and so the synergy's not there. So it takes bravery to say, okay, this university is going to go after this problem, and we're going to start, you know, trying to align our research. That's very counter to university culture, but it's the only way that we're going to make really huge strides. I think we'll do great.
You said that engineering students now, that, you know, that a lot of them that never would have had water as even part of their thinking, we're starting to do so now. Yeah. But you're saying this doesn't extend to necessarily the barriers of other kinds of learning.
I think what we're starting to see is this huge body of interdisciplinary students coming out. And I think that's come, I mean, when I went through engineering, I graduated in '92, and we were starting to talk about having environmental engineering, and there was a kind of a fight of, is that civil or chemical, or is that some interdisciplinary thing? And it was really just starting to kind of emerge. So now, all those years later, we have people coming through those sorts of interdisciplinary programs with water resource engineering or whatever else, and they're coming from, I mean, the resumes I get in my group are from across the university. So I do think this generation is being trained in interdisciplinary thinking. It's very exciting. But the people who are 20 years in did not come out of that culture. So it's a real, it's going to be a huge transformation, I think, in how we can solve these problems. I'm very optimistic.
Keep the faith, baby. All these young, we've got a whole back row of young professionals and scholars, so keep it up. Okay, questions. Who wants to pose a question to this eminent group of panelists? Yes, I see a hand there.
So thank you. My name is Mikhail Smilovic. This is a question for
We can't quite hear you.
This is a question for Bob and Emily. So Bob acknowledged that governments have been inadequate in supporting kind of Northern Ontario water issues or the capacity for governance. And Emily brought forth that mining companies are making water their business. And you eloquently stated that energy and resource development always trumps water. But it seems here that perhaps in Northern Ontario, and even with the Ring of Fire, that resource development may actually be an opportunity to bring water issues back into the sphere of dialogue and development. So does energy and resource development still trump water, or is resource development now actually an opportunity for us to progress water issues in the North in particular?
Well, it could be. I mean, it really depends on whether we get the, again, I hate to be flogging this horse, but I happen to think I'm right. If we get the governance issue right, then I think we can make some progress. But if we don't get the governance issue right, then we won't. We have a chance to do it right. The question is, are we going to do it right, or are we going to simply focus on the project and say that's the issue? And we've got to drive the project. And if the answer is we've got to drive the project, then I guarantee you that all of the other issues that we've talked about today will simply be, you know, well, yeah, we'll get there. We'll deal with that later on. And I worry. Candidly, I worry about that. I think there's a lot of pressures on the government and on the system to say, let's get up and going on this thing and let's get moving. And you say, yeah, but let's look at what are the overall impacts of development in this region. We've already seen some mining development happen without anybody really figuring out what this means for the longer term. And we haven't got much longer to kind of set up the structures that say we're going to do this right and this is how it's going to be done.
All I would add, I completely agree. I think I think there's opportunity to make a difference, but I think mining companies are trying to figure this out, how to do that, and mining is their first business. However, what I will say is I am seeing that water is beginning to trump the research, certainly water and energy. If you don't have water and energy, if you don't have permission to build, if you don't have social license to operate, you're not going to be able to mine. So I do think that those two issues are now starting to trump on new development. Existing development, I think it's you know, a whole other negotiation. But there's huge opportunity to make a change. But I agree with you. I think it's a governance issue, and I think it's unrealistic that the mining companies are going to come up with that solution. I'll do my best when working with them, but I think they're not governments. So how do we look to them to lead? Some of them are in some areas of the world, and I think as shareholders, we can hold mining companies accountable. But I think it's going to be with governments driving.
Bing is a very distinguished member of the Canadian Water Network Executive Board. He also serves with distinction on a great number of commissions on First Nation housing and what other ones, Bing?
Emergencies and water, the whole thing, anything that can happen in a community is the file I carry. And I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I'm Irving LeBlanc with the Special Advisor on Housing, Water, and Emergency Issues for the Assembly of First Nations, and have the privilege of being a member of the Board of Directors for Canadian Water Network, and really want to really point out the great work that's being done on the research mandates. One of the reasons I agreed to join the board was the amount of research that's being done on First Nations, and the need to move that from research to action, which is one of the areas that I'm really interested in. So just want to put that plug in for a bit, but I really want to...
Great. Well really done. Now get to the question.
I really want to thank Mr. Ray for bringing up all the issues that First Nations face and linking them to the challenges we face today, in particular the resource revenue sharing that I think is really, we believe is really the answer to a lot of the issues that we face. If it's in this great country, we can just share a portion of the resources that are being taken out of this country and do that. But it's hard to, really sometimes hard to not see or not to imagine that, yeah, money is also is a need. When one of the areas I'm involved in right now is the Catchment First Nation, a really challenged community. It's hard not to say, well, we do need money there, but again, money first. But in the long term, obviously, the governance issues. But and I want to move on to some of the points all of you brought up, and that's the working with resource companies, big companies, oil companies, resource companies, and the approach that take, which is very hard for them to understand, is talk to First Nations first. And I've checked with looked at some of the big companies' websites and kind of read their corporate social responsibilities on what they have. Another fellow I work with was involved with the development of the ISO 26000, and I believe one country in Africa has legislated that into their operations. What would you see would be required to, as Mr. Ray mentioned, some of these small companies still just don't get it. How do they bring their social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, to bear when they don't even have a policy? Is more government required? And I know you mentioned that probably don't need that, but is there some way that any of these industries can be mandated to make sure that they have a corporate social responsibility policy, that they look after it, that somebody monitors it? So is there, what are your thoughts on that in terms of making sure that the resource industries and others really follow what they're supposed to be doing? Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. So how do you do that? How do you diagnose the problem that big companies may feel that they have to do this? What do you do with small ones?
There's a couple of things. One is, I think that the courts have kind of defined what the law is. They've said you've got a duty to consult, a duty to accommodate, and they keep coming back to governments and everybody saying this is what the law is, it has to be done. I think governments have been very slow, provincially and federally, to actually institutionalize, well, what does that mean? How do we do that? And how do we make it happen? Frequently, what will happen is that they'll say to Company X, you've got to talk to the following 3 communities. And Company X will try to do that, but they will find that 2 communities might be having an argument about what their traditional territory actually is. Some communities are further advanced, are more pro-development, are more proactive in saying, okay, here's what you do, and here's how we do things, and this is it. Other communities are more resistant, and so the companies will throw up their hands and say, what do? We can't manage this. We don't know how to do it. At that point, it seems to me it's up to the province, and in the case of the northern areas and all the provinces, to really say, okay, here's how we need to do things after consulting and having a real conversation with the responsible Aboriginal networks, and say, here's the system that we're going to create, and here's how we're going to intervene, and we're going to mediate and try and solve it. Governments are actually very reluctant to do that because it's more work. And frankly,
it's also no-win work.
It's no-win work, but it has to be done. If they don't do it, it doesn't happen. And then they say, well, go back to court. So then you go back to court. But the courts can't actually administer the solution. The courts can only say, here's what you have to do. And so you've got to create some kind of mediation system that's going to find a resolution to these things. And I think that's a critical role that government has to play and public policy has to play, is in actually finding the solutions that will get us there. I'm actually not pessimistic, because what I actually see is that a whole lot of issues are now on a radar screen that were never there before. A lot of suffering happened and nobody knew about it. A lot of things took place. Catchment is a classic example. It's a community in constant stress. It has the highest rate of suicide of any community anywhere in the world, per capita. They lost 3 young women in the space of a weekend 4 weeks ago. Terrible things are going on, but we know about it. We're aware of it, and people are engaging with it, and there are people involving themselves with the community and breaking down that isolation. the isolation is coming to an end, which I think is absolutely essential. And it has to be the next sort of real step that we take to say that the communities are not going to be living in total isolation anymore. There has to be a process of engagement. And government has to be involved in the process, as does the private sector, as do community groups, as do schools, and all sorts of other folks who are going to be involved in this process. And that's what's going to happen. But it will not be...
Yeah, not tomorrow.
It's not going to be an easy road, and it's not going to be without a lot of bumps along the way. There's going to be a lot of bumps and arguments about it. It's inevitable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yes, I'm going to ask I'm sorry, sir, we're going to run out of time. Yes, I'm awfully sorry. I'm going to ask the two questioners who are standing up both to ask their questions one after the other, give the panel a chance to intervene on which one they'd like to, and then come back to the panel and see if people have a 30-second final piece of wisdom they want to dispatch. So yes, your question, please. Okay. Identify yourself.
Okay, thank you. My name is Darskadar from University of Alberta. I'm happy to hear that water crisis has got a priority position at the at the World Economic Forum. And I would like to ask the panelists one question. My question is, what should be the role of private sector in the water sector? World Bank has proposed a PPP approach, public-private partnership approach for water sector, and we have seen a big achievement of this PP for irrigation development, for example. So what should be the role of private sector in the water?
Okay, thank you. The PPP debate. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Good day. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for a great panel. My name is Sharon Nelson. I'm from Montreal, Concordia University. The question I have is about the paradigm shifts that you talked about, and timelines. I know that you're talking about governments are slow to react, but at the same time, in '92, when you finished, Emily, when you finished, it wasn't, sustainability was just on the map. So it's, we're talking about in real terms today what we can do today, but we also have to look forward. And what are the timelines can we kind of estimate? Your CEO is seeing something, governments are seeing something. In '95, that professor created, something kind of impossible in South Africa. So just kind of projecting forward, and with the optimism and imagination that we all talked about, how do you see water in the next 20 years and all these players working together and that interdisciplinary commitment, if you will?
There's a nice, easy question. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes. How do you see water in the next 20 years? Actually, I'm really glad you asked it because, when the WEF declares water as the #1 risk to economic interests, I think that could drive us both ways. It could drive us to doing things better, or it could make everybody feel, I need to get my part of it and build the walls around it. So it's a very astute question. So who wants to take on either PPPs or the timing of the paradigm shift and where we're going? Why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, first of all, I'll address the PPP quickly. PPP to me is just a funding model. It's just how are you paying for it? Is it the government paying, and then it's really just who's investing the capital, really, and then are you paying on a toll system, and there's acceptability standards around are we willing for private enterprise to own our water systems, and in Canada so far has been pretty reluctant to do that, but other parts of the world it's standard. So I just think it's a commercial model. And so that's almost a separate discussion. What we are seeing is a lot of companies are interested in taking on these new commercial models, and so I think there's some really interesting opportunities to develop new projects around the world. But in terms of the question of how are things going to change, I think they're going to change very rapidly, and I actually think right now, 2 years ago, I would have said water was a harder problem than energy. But I actually think water is an easier problem than energy. I think if you think about that water-energy nexus, I think there's so many things that we can do to be smarter with water that we're just getting going in many ways. We're always going to need water, but water water's not a finite resource in a sense that it recycles around. And so I actually think that with clever solutions, with interdisciplinary thinking, I think in 20 years we're going to be in a completely different place. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be in a completely different place on energy. I'm much more pessimistic on energy. Maybe that's just because of the group that I'm running. But, but I really do think we can make transformational change. And I think we're at a moment of transformational change in the way that we're thinking about water. So I'm very optimistic.
Bob?
I agree entirely with Emily on PPP. I think we've allowed this whole issue of water privatization to become a bugaboo. It's not a bugaboo. You don't need to own something to control it and manage it and regulate it. Government has to maintain its capacity as a regulator. Who owns something is much less important. And I think this is an issue that Canadians need to think through carefully and deal with, but I'm not as fussed about it as some people are. I am convinced as well that water is going to become more expensive and that metering and tolling water is necessary for conservation. If you don't price something, you don't conserve something, and that's the other issue we have as Canadians. We assume because of all of our National Geographic pictures in our head that the supply of water is as Emily says, is infinite. Well, yeah, it is, but you've also got to think about conserving it. I think the big issue going forward with us on water, which we haven't even discussed, is water a Canadian resource or is it a North American resource? And that is a huge issue for us. And believe me,
I told you he was brave.
It's going to be at our doorstep in much shorter time than you might think. And there will be a very lively discussion in the country about that, because that is an issue that touches very, very deeply the core of our identity. It also raises issues about our relationships with our neighbors to the south. So I think that's going to be a critical question for Canadians going forward on the water side. I think the other big issue is going to be on resource development in the country as to where water sits in that discussion. I don't think you can have a sensible discussion about fracking. I don't think you can have a sensible discussion about the extent of the oil development that's taking place in some parts of the country without also having a conversation about water. And I think we've been reluctant to have that discussion, but I think it needs to happen. And I think it needs to be front and center in some of the debates that are happening in British Columbia and Alberta. I think the issue of water is, and groundwater, the quality of our groundwater, what's happening to groundwater, I think these should not be dismissed as issues. They are real issues that we need to deal with.
Two slightly different takes on both the questions. In the World Economic Forum Global Risk Register, water is being graduated from an environmental risk to a societal risk, and it changes the conversation quite markedly. And the nature of the public-private partnership discussion we need to have is way beyond the special purpose vehicles. And just to mention one example we are experimenting with, as are a couple of countries in the world, the WEF has a water resources group. And the South African chapter of that group is called the SWPN, the Strategic Water Partnership Network. And this is about bringing public players and private players together, not to discuss their problems, not to discuss the different tender processes and special purpose vehicles, but what are the water issues that we mutually identify with, and what can we do together around that? And something is starting to happen in a very positive way. And I think it points the direction, if that proliferates sufficiently and gets enough momentum, around the way we can be looking at that in the future. And talking about the next 20 years, there's a group of folk, a large group of folk, that involves a couple of people in this room, that belong to something called the Global Water Futures Initiative. And it will have its first report tabled in Daegu, Korea at the World Water Forum #7 next month. That is starting to answer this question in a much more vivid way. But my own view on this is that there is no sector, there is no security sector that hasn't already defined for itself water as a critical success factor. You know, whether it's energy security or health security or physical security or nutritional security. So whatever the primary agenda is of these various groups around the world, one of the critical success factors is water. And our ability to put a lens around that and bring people to play in that space is what's going to make this work or not work in the long term. The second point I want to make is that the notion around, we've been talking about this for a while, folk have kept talking about the next world war being about water. We've been fighting about water for all the time we've been around.
Yes, we have.
And what is becoming more and more visual is the new arenas in which we're fighting about water, because it's no longer the physical fights like in the Middle East. It's now become the fights in the WTO and various other arenas. It could go very negatively, Margaret, but we have to have the sense of mind to pull that out as the priority and work up the right kind of solutions that provides a water solution for the world on the back of which you're going to get all of these other securities that are important to us.
PPP. Water is the ultimate public good. Nobody but a public authority can own water. Who delivers it can be decided by the public good, to be delivered by a variety of parapublic utilities, corporatized utilities, private sector utilities, or as most of the Canadian model, public sector owned and managed utilities. But that's a decision that is made about how to do the actual delivery of water. The classical private sector involvement in delivering water was done through something called concessions, which were very long-term arrangements, where the company actually owned the infrastructure and therefore had a vested interest in keeping it in good shape, because most of the contracts were 30 years long. So there was an advantage to this, because the company wouldn't start to make money until the end of that contract, substantial money. And so therefore they kept the water facilities in pretty good shape. But you know, there were obviously other issues, ideological and others, associated with that. As a result, that particular model has just about disappeared. You've still got companies involved in water, and you always will have. For example, the treatment and processing of wastewater is very largely a private sector task in contracting with a public sector entity, because nobody has yet discovered a way of convincing people that they really ought to pay a lot of money to have their waste processed properly. It takes a government in the middle, sort of saying through the tax power or through the regulatory power, you are going to pay to have your sewage to be processed properly. But usually it's a private sector entity that's in there. And private sector makes the pumps, the pipes, the cement, and all the rest of it. So, and the private sector is a great big user. So people who say, do you think the private sector should be involved in water, are first of all posing an unrealistic issue, because the private sector is deeply involved in water. The real question is, what should be the regulatory and the conditions under which, particularly for some kinds of transactions, the private sector operates. And there you get into negotiations with the public sector. So in one sense, I think, like Bob, that it can become a hobgoblin, because it gets shaded in all sorts of very emotional kind of wishes or emotional kind of language. So the paradigm, you know, I can design the paradigm 20 years out. You can really work out what would be a very good way to manage water and how it could be done. Where I have the problem is getting through the next 10 years. There are so many real puzzles in water, the unwillingness to pay, particularly the fact that in most governments, there's up to 17 government departments at many levels that have jurisdictional power over water, the lack of real knowledge about water, the vociferous tendencies of scholarship on water. All of these things are such challenges to be overcome. So as I say, I can design a new water system for the world, she says presumptuously. I mean, but I can tell you where we need to get in 15, 20 years. The real difficulty is trying to see how it is that we move forward in our comfortable lives with a number of interests, public, private, all the rest of it, that have their part of the puzzle all very much mapped out in their own minds. So that's the part that when I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't think of how we're going to get around that one. So anyway, I think we've had a great panel today. I'm going to ask each one of them if they want to give a 30-second final word. And then I'm going to ask you after that to join me in thanking them very much. So would you like to start off? Would you like to start off with a final word?
Sure. I guess what I would say, I know there are a lot of students in the room, and so maybe talking to the people who are going to be driving the next 20 years, hopefully driving in 20 years if you aren't right from the second that you come out, is picking the grand challenges. And I think if many of you will end up in the private sector, and if you're in the private sector, making those big picture connections, thinking about things like governance, bringing the experience that you've got out of this sort of interdisciplinary network into the private sector where you may not be in that same kind of environment, but bringing that with you is incredibly powerful. That's how we're going to get the change, is the people that can be thinking not just about what I'm doing today or what I'm doing next week or the plant that I'm trying to build, but how this all fits into the big picture and being involved in these kinds of debates. That's how things are going to change.
Bob?
I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists for continuing my education, which is an ongoing project, and thank the audience very much for being such gracious listeners and participants in the discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been a good morning for me. Thank you very much.
I think the thing that I want to add is that there are various things that are pulling out water as a primary issue, as a critical success factor to our future prosperity. And this is very useful. The risk associated with that is there isn't a vector yet on these issues, and it can go in both directions. And I think it's our collective responsibility to engage the complexity, to hold the burden when the burden becomes too difficult to bear, and find the novelty around breaking the pathway. Because the difficulty with water is that we've always had the ability to survive when it wasn't around in sufficient quantities. And we settle very quickly into the boiled frog syndrome. And this is something we have to really worry about. But thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Good. Well, I want to thank the technicians who collaborated in taking down so that we could actually see you over here. I know you can see us on the big screen, but it isn't quite the same. Thank you to our technical staff who kept the room going. Thank you very much to those who arranged this session. Bob, thank you for taking your time and for all the nice things and good things you said about CWRN. You're entirely right. But I just wanted to confirm you in your rightness of this. Emily, thanks so much for bringing an excellent perspective on what it is we do. It's much more fun to demonize the private sector than it is to hear such a reasonable person coming forward and saying, well, you know, this is the way it actually works. And Deskin, you came literally from the other side of the world. And so we're enormously grateful that you came all this direction, all this distance. And thank you very much for being with us. And I want you to thank them all together.